Hi, my name's Daver, and in this video, I'm going to show you how I made this stand for my synthesizers out of walnut for the Rockler Hobby Challenge. I also made all the music for this video too, so stick around. This is Daver Made. So about a couple months ago, I was listening to the Modern Maker podcast, and if you haven't checked it out, I highly recommend it. On that podcast, they had announced that Rockler was going to do a hobby challenge. The one requirement needed to be whatever you were making had to incorporate another hobby outside of woodworking, and whatever you made had to have some type of wood component. Making music, especially synth music, is actually another passion of mine in addition to woodworking. So I have had these Korg Volca Synths, which are mini little synthesizers. I always wanted to make some kind of stand or something for them so I could set them up and it would be easier to play them together. I thought that the Rockler Hobby Challenge was the perfect reason to finally stop procrastinating and make a stand for my Volcas. So for the synthesizer stand, I knew that I wanted to make it out of walnut. Walnut is my favorite wood that I can afford, and I wanted to showcase my Korg Volcas in a very nice way. So why not use walnut? I decided to base my design off the OG synthesizer, the Minimoog. Minimoog? Moog? I think it's Moog. It's a classic synthesizer from the 70s. If you're not familiar with Moog synthesizers, check it out. They make some really cool stuff. The Minimoog is just such an iconic synthesizer. I thought there would be no better design to pull inspiration from than that. I've dubbed this the Volca Moog as a little homage to the Minimoog. This is the first time I've ever hooked up all my synths and stuff like that together. Actually, I have two more synths that I didn't even add to this, so I'm not gonna go into the details. Most people are watching this for woodworking, but Google this stuff. It's cool as shit. All right. For this project, I decided to use some scrap pieces that I had left over from previous projects, and I picked the most figured walnut pieces I could find out of my scrap pile, and I laid out my Korg Volca synths in roughly the configuration that the synths would actually rest on the stand. Then I took the scrap pieces of wood, which were already kind of rough cut, and placed them around, and then that way I could get more specific measurements for the final dimensions of the synth stand. And I'm also trying to figure out what's the best way to hold the synths inside the stand. And I decided to go with some walnut dowels for the lower level and some 1/4-inch plywood for the top section that moves up and down. I also broke this build up into two sections. First, I worked on the top portion that would move up and down, and then I would work on the lower portion, which was static. As I broke all the lumber down to its final size, I made sure to test fit an inch up on each cut to make sure that I didn't waste any of this walnut that I had. I also marked the specific pieces that would show off certain figuring on the walnut, and to also make sure I didn't route these grooves on the wrong side of the piece. I routed these grooves in order to hold a panel that would support the two Volcas on the top side of the synth stand. And I'm just checking for fit. Even with wood movement, these should be able to slide in and out. And that's essentially the top portion, which is super simple. And now here is me sanding. But here's also me making some of the music that you're listening to right now. For the glue up, I decided to use hide glue, which gives you a longer open time, and it's pretty easy to work with and really good for finer pieces like this. I had some challenges trying to figure out how to clamp this up, and I just used one of the oldest clamps you could find called the brick. I think that with the use of these cauls, it really provided some even clamping pressure on this otherwise awkward glue up. Now it was time to work on the lower portion of the synth stand. I first started with working on the side pieces and roughly outlined the shape that I wanted to cut out. As with the top portion of the synth stand, I continuously test fit using the Volcas themselves as I fit it together and did my cuts. To cut the angle on the sides, I used my Rockler tapering jig, and I pretty much guessed what the angle was for the pieces on the original Minimoog, and I think this angle was good enough. And here's a reason why you wear eye protection. Once I cut the two side pieces, I then brought it to the stretcher piece and marked out the height and ripped it down on the table saw. Next, I measured the final width of the stretcher pieces to connect the two sides. I didn't show it, but I cut them all down and everything fit nicely together. And then I wanted to clean up the angled cuts on the side pieces because they were a little rough from the table saw. And I'm using the CA glue and tape trick here to attach both these pieces together. And that way it'll allow me to use my innovative belt sander that I clamped down to my portable workbench to sand down to the line and even out the angles on both side pieces. And then I sanded and sanded some more. The next step was to route over some of the edges on these pieces to give it a nice profile and also try to mimic the roundovers on the original Minimoog. I think this detail was a very nice homage to the Minimoog and makes the piece more visually appealing. The next step was gluing everything together, and I decided to use dowels. And here I'm marking out where my dowels will go. And I'm using these dowel point things to give me an idea where I needed to drill the opposite dowel holes. There isn't a lot of space, so I had to be very careful not to drill too close to the edges, because then I would ruin this piece and possibly the entire project. As I drilled the dowel holes, I did some dry fitting before the glue up. For the bottom row of Volcas, I wanted to have some way to support them at an angle so it was easier for playing and adjusting them. I decided to use walnut dowels to do this. I'm using a 3/8 inch dowel and a 1/4 inch dowel. My idea was to space them out at slightly different heights to elevate the Volcas slightly. And this was something that made me nervous because I had to be super precise and, again, not drill too close to the edge. Now, in addition to supporting the Volcas at a specific angle that kind of matched the angle of the side pieces, they did add some extra reinforcement to the entire synth stand. Ooh, that's close. Now it was time for the glue up. Once again, I'm using Titebond's hide glue. Which gave me a longer open time just to make sure everything fit nice and snugly. Snugly? Snug. Another good thing about hide glue is that if you don't get all the squeeze out, it does blend in well with the finish. And then I added some clamps and let the glue dry. While the bottom portion of the synth stand was drying, I decided to route a handle in the top portion to make moving it up and down a little bit easier. I'm using a cove bit to route out the handle. I've never done this before, so I really had to be careful because it was pretty much one shot. And if I screwed it up, I'd have to remake the whole top portion. Now, it wasn't perfect, but for my first time doing a route like this, I think it was fine. And then I just took a chisel to even everything out and then eventually sanded it all down. After sanding was complete with my orbital sander, I went over everything by hand. And then to clean off all the dust, I used some mineral spirits. I used General Finish's Armor Seal satin finish for this project. This finish is super easy to apply, and it really makes that figured walnut stand out. I did a total of 3 coats, waiting 12 hours in between each coat. Once the finish was dry, I added a layer of clear paste wax, which adds a little extra protection and makes the walnut feel really nice to the touch. I have to say that the finish turned out awesome, and I really like how the walnut looks. And that completes the main build portion of the synth stand. Next, I turned my attention to creating the kickstand that would hold up the top portion when it was in the upright position. I had some scrap maple that I decided to use as the kickstand piece. I wanted to make sure that the piece could fit underneath the top portion of the synth stand so it would rest flat when it was in the down position. And in order to do this, I used a hinge. The last step was attaching the top portion to the lower portion of the synth stand, and it appeared that the original Minimoog is using a piano hinge, so I decided to go about using a piano hinge as well for this synth stand in order to make the top portion move up and down easily. And installing this was fairly simple, but I had to make sure that it was centered just right and that the top portion was aligned so it would easily move up and down. And that completes the build. So I would say that this was a challenge making the stand. For me, it was getting the piano hinge and the top portion to articulate just right. With the stand on the back to hold this up, I'm gonna need to figure out how to lock it, because depending on the surface, especially my workbench, which is a shellacked MDF top, it was falling. So I had to add a 2x4 to hold it up. Eventually, I'm gonna go back and figure out how to make that stand lock. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching and take care.